April 1945. The Louisiana Enigma. Louisiana, April 1945. The oppressive humidity saturated the atmosphere surrounding a repurposed manufacturing facility that currently functioned as a prisoner-of-war detention center. 63 German women disembarked from military transportation trucks, their quivering hands exposing the overwhelming fear surging through their bodies. Each pulse reverberated with absolute terror. The accounts they had internalized were categorical. American jailers were savage. American confinement facilities were equivalent to extermination. Their leaders' propaganda apparatus had embedded one singular message into their minds: imprisonment assured agony. They prepared themselves for physical violence. They foresaw methodical starvation. They awaited deliberate retribution for their country's transgressions. What emerged instead contradicted every prediction: a hot plate overflowing with sustenance. Yet here surfaces the confounding component. Upon tasting their first mouthfuls, thankfulness didn't emerge. Gratitude remained silent. Instead, one woman grasped her drinking vessel and consumed it frantically within moments. Another captive made eye contact with her military guard, her countenance projecting distrust, and questioned, "Are you attempting to poison us deliberately?" The American sentry simply laughed, comprehending what these imprisoned German women couldn't grasp. Positioned upon that utilitarian plate existed a substance completely unfamiliar to their gastronomic knowledge. Something intensely saline, mystifyingly unknown, so utterly foreign to their cultural understanding that it questioned every belief they possessed about their opponents. The Americans designated it corned beef, and this preserved flesh was about to fundamentally alter their understanding of the country detaining them. But what followed? That's exactly where this account exceeds the commonplace. Stay present until the finale, because this narrative reaches far beyond simple nourishment. This concerns conflict, organized falsehood, and that critical moment when those labeled as adversaries reconnect with their collective humanity. If accounts of this nature appeal to you, subscribe to this platform without delay. Interact with this material, sustain this channel, and let's examine one of World War II's most peculiar gastronomic incidents. Everything began when the transportation truck stopped and the reinforced entrance swung wide. They came expecting utter catastrophe. The military vehicle slowed outside a converted manufacturing building in Louisiana. Spring 1945 signified the concluding stage of European warfare. Germany's collapse was unavoidable. These 63 women comprehended exactly what collapse meant during wartime. The accounts had spread continuously. Enemy captives suffered methodical violence, underwent intentional starvation, endured deliberate degradation, were left to decay in confined spaces like farm animals. Their own superior officers had delivered explicit cautions. Nazi propaganda mechanisms had assured them that Americans embodied barbarism. Imprisonment meant either termination or consequences deemed more severe. Therefore, when the vehicle doors parted, the German women braced themselves mentally. They consisted of medical personnel, wireless transmission experts, communication corps professionals, Wehrmacht support staff who had functioned behind battle zones. Most were in their third decade. Some were even younger. A select few had just turned 18. None had fired armaments in warfare. None had directly ended human life. However, they displayed German military attire. Presently, they represented enemy possessions. Sentries guided them past steel barriers. Their combat boots created reverberations across cement flooring. Their vision methodically examined for danger signals. Razor wire structures. Raised observation platforms. Assault canines. They discovered all three protection mechanisms. Yet something else filled the atmosphere. The scent. It reached their perception before they approached the dining area. Heated, dense, saline, comparable to seawater combined with prepared meat. One woman later described it as the most unusual aroma I had ever experienced inside a confined building. They were unaware then, but that particular fragrance was American corned beef, and it was prepared to perplex them more deeply than any combat situation ever had. Inside the intake area, American servicemen handed out coverings to them. Pristine coverings. Then cleansing bars, authentic cleansing bars. Followed by a small drying cloth, a dental brush, and a hair implement. The women traded confused looks. Was this sophisticated trickery? Based on United States military records, American prisoner facilities handled more than 425,000 German detainees by conflict's termination. By late 1945, the framework had transformed into something enormous, mechanized, systematically arranged, and the protocols were explicit. Detainees obtained matching fundamental provisions as American military personnel, identical sustenance, matching servings, equivalent courses. This represented no preferential accommodation. This constituted routine operating standards. Nevertheless, to the German women crossing those barriers, it seemed impossibly fantastic. One previous communication technician, Ingrid Muller, later recounted that instance during a 1987 conversation. "We continued expecting when the actual handling would start," she expressed. "We presumed the compassion represented a strategic deception, a mental technique to diminish us before disciplinary action began. The discipline never occurred. Rather, sentries indicated them toward the dining facility. The evening meal was prepared. The building was large and functional. Steel tables, timber bench arrangements, American food preparers wearing white garments stood behind a distribution counter. Vapor rose from substantial cooking containers, service plates collided rhythmically, eating implements made scraping sounds. It appeared like any military dining room. Nothing intimidating, nothing harsh. But for women cultivated under authoritarian Nazi administration, the scenario defied reasoning. Adversaries were meant to possess animosity. Jailers were meant to cause injury. Yet here they remained, obtaining nourishment like visitors at an unusual family meal. The plates appeared. On each one sat a considerable portion of something rosy crimson, shimmering with oily substance. Adjacent to it, faded green leafy vegetable, a helping of crushed potatoes, a slice of grain product. The flesh looked moist, glossy, nearly artificially pigmented. Multiple women paused. Several murmured amongst themselves. One asked a sentinel, indicating at the flesh, What is this substance?" The sentinel raised his shoulders indifferently. "Corned beef." The terminology held zero significance to them. Corned beef was non-existent in Germany. Not appearing like this. Not salt preserved in liquid for extended periods. Not presented in this fashion. They positioned themselves gradually, utensils raised cautiously, vision examined the unfamiliar flesh. And in that quietness, held between anxiety, starvation, and bewilderment, the initial taste started. What occurred afterward would stay with these women across their complete existence. Not because of harshness but due to the total lack of it. Because the authentic astonishment wasn't the flavor of the flesh. It was the understanding that everything they had been informed about Americans might be essentially incorrect. To understand why corned beef astonished these women, you must initially comprehend their background. Germany held a comprehensive heritage with preserved flesh, but it carried zero similarity to American eating behaviors. In German food preparation areas, flesh was smoked. It was atmosphere dried. It was processed into sausages with careful seasoning combinations. Households passed down formulas through lineages. A matriarch's sausage formula was revered. A meat craftsman's preservation method represented his occupational existence. German conservation constituted an artistic practice, unhurried, methodical, territorial. Every geographic region held its unique delicacy. Bavaria possessed its Weisswurst. Thuringia possessed its Bratwurst. The Black Forest possessed its renowned smoked pork. These weren't simply edibles. They were ethnic identifications. And sodium? Certainly Germans employed sodium, but never in this fashion. American corned beef originated from an entirely separate custom. It was created from requirement, not heritage. Throughout the 1800s, Irish migrants in New York needed affordable flesh that persisted. Jewish meat vendors in Manhattan provided them beef chest cut, and the Irish conserved it the sole method they understood, saturated in enormous amounts of rough sodium. The term corn didn't indicate corn, the seed. It indicated the substantial corns or crystals of stone sodium employed in the salting procedure. The flesh remained in saline liquid for extended periods, occasionally a full month. The sodium destroyed microorganisms. It modified the consistency. It converted the beef rosy. By World War II, corned beef had transformed into a foundation of American military supplies. It was affordable. It persisted eternally. It could be transported across waters without decomposing. The U.S. Army acquired exceeding 2.5 billion pounds of tinned and refined flesh throughout the conflict. Corned beef represented a meaningful segment of that quantity. Warriors ate it in dugouts. Naval personnel ate it on vessels. And currently detainees ate it in enclosures. But for German women who developed eating refined smoked pork and subtle herb sausages, corned beef was a foreign material. One detainee, Hilda Brandt, a medical worker seized near the Rhine, subsequently documented in her personal account about her initial interaction with the flesh. "It was so intensely saline that my mouth tissue burned," she remembered. I believed the Americans were trying to poison us gradually. I couldn't understand why anyone would eat this voluntarily. She wasn't isolated in her bewilderment. The dining facility became silent. Steel plates rested on timber tables. Vapor ascended from the sustenance. Utensils remained in hesitant palms, and 63 sets of vision fixed on the unusual rosy flesh facing them. This was the initial authentic bite. Beyond, Louisiana moisture compressed against the glass panes. Within, the atmosphere carried thick scents of sodium and heated leafy vegetable. Overhead rotating devices spun gradually, distributing the heated atmosphere in unhurried rotations. Somewhere in the food preparation area, containers made loud sounds. A food preparer yelled something in English. The German women grasped none of it. They solely grasped starvation and anxiety and the perplexing course facing them. One woman raised her utensil initially. Her designation was Elsa Richter. She was 24, a previous communications worker from Dresden. She had endured Allied explosive attacks that terminated thousands. She had observed her municipality ignite. And currently she positioned in an American detention enclosure, observing a portion of moist, saline flesh. She separated a modest piece. She elevated it to her oral cavity. She masticated. Her countenance transformed instantly. Her vision expanded. Her mandible decelerated. She extended for her liquid container and consumed half of it in one swallow. Mein Gott, she murmured. My God. The women surrounding her observed. Some inclined forward, others inclined backward. Several placed down their utensils completely. But starvation was more powerful than mistrust. Individually they commenced to consume. The responses were instantaneous and diverse. Some expelled air forcefully. Some contorted their faces. Several displaced their plates away completely. One youthful woman, scarcely 19, commenced laughing, an anxious, perplexed laugh that distributed down the surface like a surge. An American sentinel positioned adjacent observed the scenario with entertainment. He had experienced this previously with male detainees. But somehow observing these women respond seemed distinct. More humanistic. Less like handling adversaries and more like accommodating perplexed visitors at an exceptionally unusual dinner gathering. Based on enclosure documentation, the routine prisoner allocation incorporated roughly 3,300 energy units per day. This was the matching quantity provided to American warriors in non-warfare positions. It incorporated flesh, plant foods, grain product, and occasionally sweet course. By military criteria it was abundant. By German criteria it was incomprehensible. In their homeland, common citizens were experiencing starvation. Distribution cards restricted households to minuscule servings of flesh per 7-day period. Grain product was combined with timber dust. Offspring went without nourishment. Aged individuals expired from nutritional deficiency. And here, in an adversary detention facility, German women were being presented more sustenance than their own households could imagine. The contradiction was nearly too substantial to consume, more substantial even than the sodium. One detainee, Margaret Vogel, subsequently characterized the instance in correspondence to her sibling following the conflict. The flesh was dreadful, she documented. So saline I believed my oral organ would fracture. But I consumed every morsel because I was uncertain when sustenance would arrive again. I didn't have confidence in them yet. That lack of confidence was omnipresent. It suspended in the atmosphere like the vapor from the leafy vegetable. Every compassionate act seemed like deception. Every filled plate seemed like falsehood. Some women consumed rapidly, defending their plates with their limbs, previous patterns from insufficiency. Others consumed gradually, monitoring the sentries, anticipating the deception to expose itself. But the deception never materialized. The sentries didn't ridicule them. The food preparers didn't deride them. The sustenance, unusual as it existed, continued arriving. One food preparer, a substantial individual from Texas designated Harold Brennan, traversed through the dining facility presenting additional servings. More? He inquired, indicating at the corned beef. Most women declined by head movement. Several extended their plates. Brennan subsequently informed a questioner, these females were frightened of everything. Frightened of the sustenance, frightened of us, frightened of what arrived next. You could observe it in their vision. All I could accomplish was continue presenting and anticipate they comprehended we weren't going to injure them. By the termination of the course, plates were predominantly vacant. Not because the sustenance had favorable flavor, but because these women had discovered previously that you never squander a course. Still, as they departed from the dining facility, One inquiry remained in every consciousness. Why were the Americans being so compassionate? And what would they desire in exchange? The objections arrived rapidly. Within days, American food preparers detected a configuration. German women consumed nearly everything on their plates. The potatoes vanished. The grain product disappeared. The leafy vegetable was endured. But the corned beef? Half of it returned unconsumed. Plates returned to the food preparation area with rosy portions scarcely contacted. Sometimes just one morsel was absent. Sometimes the flesh was displaced to the periphery, concealed under leafy vegetable like proof of a modest violation. The food preparers conversed amongst themselves. What was incorrect with these women? Didn't they appreciate flesh? Sergeant Harold Brennan transported the matter to his administrator. They're not consuming the beef, he communicated. They consume all their liquid. They request more grain product, but they abandon the flesh. The administrator raised his shoulders. It's quality flesh, matching as we consume. And that was accurate. The corned beef presented to German prisoners was matching to what American warriors obtained. Matching formula, matching sodium concentration, matching preparation. There was zero distinction. But distinction wasn't the difficulty. Flavor was. Enclosure documentation from 1945 demonstrates that sustenance squandering was monitored meticulously. The military detested squandering. Every unconsumed portion meant squandered currency, squandered transportation, squandered exertion. So when configurations surfaced, food preparers were anticipated to modify. And modify they accomplished. Initially, they diminished the sodium in the leafy vegetable. German women had protested that everything had oceanic flavor. By making the plant foods more subtle, the comprehensive course became more endurable. Subsequently, they augmented the grain product serving. Grain product was recognizable. Grain product was secure. German prisoners consumed grain product enthusiastically, employing it to occupy their digestive systems when other sustenance seemed excessively foreign. Then arrived the potatoes. Additional scoops materialized on plates. Crushed potatoes assisted absorbing the sodium from the beef, making each morsel less powerful. Ultimately, someone presented mustard. It was a modest thing. A yellow compression container positioned on each surface. But it transformed everything. German women recognized mustard. German mustard was renowned. Acute, acidic, ideal with sausages. American mustard was more sugary, more subtle, nearly like a condiment. But it was recognizable sufficiently to seem like homeland. One detainee, Ursula Kraft, subsequently remembered the revelation in a conversation. A woman at my surface placed mustard on the saline flesh, she expressed. I observed her consume it without making a facial expression, so I attempted it also. The mustard assisted. It obscured some of the sodium. Following that, I consistently employed mustard. Information distributed rapidly through the sleeping quarters. Mustard assists. Grain product assists. Potatoes assist. Gradually, the women formulated approaches to endure corned beef day. They weren't appreciating the sustenance, but they were controlling it. American food preparers detected the transformation. Plates commenced returning vacant. The rosy portions vanished along with everything else. Brennan displayed satisfaction when he observed it. They're comprehending it, he informed his personnel. Provide them duration. Duration was something these women possessed abundantly. Days transformed into 7-day periods. 7-day periods transformed into lunar cycles. The conflict in Europe terminated. Germany capitulated. But the women stayed in Louisiana, anticipating repatriation documentation, anticipating vessels, anticipating a country that no longer existed as they recalled it. And throughout that anticipation, something unanticipated occurred. The sustenance commenced to seem ordinary. Corned beef still had saline flavor. It still appeared unusual. But it no longer astonished them. It became habitual, anticipated, even dependable. One woman, Bridget Stein, documented in her personal journal throughout this duration. Tuesday signifies corned beef, she recorded. I don't cherish it, but I consume it. I possess thankfulness for it. In homeland, my maternal parent is consuming vegetation liquid. Here I am consuming flesh, authentic flesh. I possess zero entitlement to protest. That viewpoint modified everything. Protests diminished. Mistrust mellowed. The women discontinued anticipating harshness and commenced accepting actuality. The Americans were not attempting to poison them. The Americans were not attempting to discipline them. The Americans were simply nourishing them the sole method they comprehended. It wasn't flawless. It wasn't German. But it was adequate. And occasionally adequate is the commencement of comprehension. The food preparers continued presenting. The women continued consuming. And somewhere between the sodium and the mustard, two civilizations discovered an unusual intermediate position. But the authentic astonishment was still approaching. Nobody anticipated it. 8 7-day periods had elapsed since the German women initially came to the enclosure. 8 7-day periods of modification. 8 7-day periods of education. 8 7-day periods of gradually acknowledging that this unusual American sustenance would not terminate them. Then one Tuesday dawn, the selection transformed. The cooks had obtained a transportation of tinned pork. It was a welcomed interruption from habit. Pork necessitated reduced preparation. It had more subtle flavor. It appeared like in simple achievement. Midday plates emerged with substantial portions of rosy pork, verdant legumes and spread grain rolls. The food preparers anticipated expressions of satisfaction. They anticipated thankfulness. They anticipated the German women to commemorate the transformation. Rather, they obtained inquiries. One woman neared the presenting boundary. Her designation was Liesel Hartmann. She was 31, a previous Wehrmacht administrative worker seized near Belgium. She had been in the enclosure extended than most. She communicated a modest English currently, fragmented, cautious, but comprehensible. She observed the plate. She observed the food preparer. Then she inquired a question that made Harold Brennan discontinue mid-distribution. Where is the saline flesh? Brennan's eyes contracted. What? The saline flesh, Liesel reiterated. The crimson flesh. Extremely saline. Where is it? Brennan fixed his vision on her for an extended instant. Then he commenced laughing. You signify corned beef? He inquired. Affirmative, corned beef. When does it return? Brennan displaced his cranium in disbelief. He rotated to his colleague food preparers. Did you perceive that? She desires the corned beef returned. The food preparation area erupted in laughter. Not harsh laughter. Astonished laughter. The variety of laughter that arrives when the existence discontinues making logic. 4 7-day periods, these women had protested. They had contorted their faces. They had displaced the flesh aside. They had designated it sodium blocks. They had expressed humor about transforming into preserved vegetables. And currently they desired it returned. Brennan cleaned his palms on his protective garment. Subsequent Tuesday he expressed. Corned beef returned subsequent Tuesday. Liesel indicated approval earnestly. Satisfactory. We will anticipate. She acquired her pork plate and departed. Behind her, other women were possessing comparable conversations. Multiple inquired sentries about the absent corned beef. Several appeared authentically dissatisfied. Information distributed through the enclosure within temporal units. The German women longed for the saline flesh. It transformed into an account that sentries reiterated for annual cycles. The matching dish that once generated bewilderment was currently being solicited. The matching flavor that once appeared like discipline was currently anticipated, even desired. How did this occur? The response was more uncomplicated than anyone conceived. Humans modify. Flavor modifies. Comfort modifies. Corned beef had transformed recognizable. It indicated the schedule. It communicated habit. In an existence with zero regulation, zero liberty, zero confidence about the forthcoming, that habit mattered more than flavor. One detainee, Gertrude Wendt, clarified it annual cycles subsequently in a German visual record. We didn't cherish the flavor, she expressed. But we cherished recognizing what to anticipate. Corned beef signified Tuesday. Tuesday signified another 7-day period endured. It provided us something to possess. There was another explanation also. A more profound one. The women had ultimately acknowledged that Americans were not their adversaries. Not authentically. The sentries expressed humor with them. The food preparers attempted to assist them. The sustenance continued arriving day following day without harshness or stipulations. Corned beef was component of that understanding. If Americans consumed this matching saline flesh voluntarily, then perhaps Americans were not creatures. Perhaps they were simply individuals with distinct flavors, distinct customs, distinct methods of conserving sustenance. And if Americans were simply individuals, then perhaps the conflict had been constructed on falsehoods. That consideration was hazardous. It disturbed everything these women had possessed confidence in. But the proof positioned on their plates every Tuesday. Rosy, saline, undisputable. When corned beef returned the subsequent 7-day period, something had transformed in the dining facility. Women consumed without protesting. Several even displayed satisfaction as they masticated. One woman elevated her liquid container toward Brennan in a modest salutation. He didn't comprehend the indication, but he indicated acknowledgement. Somewhere between mistrust and acknowledgement, a barrier had collapsed. Not a governmental barrier. Not a military barrier. Simply a modest humanistic barrier demolished by sodium and grain product and duration. And that, perhaps, was the most unusual triumph of all. The conflict terminated. The enclosures vacated. The women departed homeland. But homeland was not what they recalled. Germany in 1946 was a country of devastation. Municipalities' position flattened. Manufacturing facilities remained silent. Households investigated for absent relatives. Sustenance was more insufficient than ever. The typical German common citizen endured on fewer than 1,500 energy units per day. Many endured on reduced. The women who returned from American imprisonment transported something unanticipated with them. Not fury. Not animosity. Not accounts of persecution or misuse. They transported bewilderment and thankfulness and recollections of saline flesh. One previous detainee, Ingrid Muller, came in Hamburg to discover her youth residence obliterated. Her maternal parent was deceased. Her male sibling was absent. She possessed nothing remaining except the garments she displayed and the recollections she transported. Annual cycles subsequently, she informed a questioner something extraordinary. When I was experiencing starvation in Hamburg, I contemplated about that American dining facility, she expressed. I contemplated about the corned beef I once detested. I would have surrendered anything for one portion. Just one portion of that saline flesh I utilized to displace away. Her account was not singular. Margaret Vogel, who once documented about her fractured oral organ from excessive sodium, subsequently transformed into an educational worker in West Germany. She instructed history to adolescents, and she consistently incorporated one instruction that astonished her pupils. I informed them about the corned beef, she expressed in a 1978 conversation. I informed them how I detested it, how I experienced anxiety of it, how I ultimately longed for it. And I informed them what it instructed me. That adversaries are not consistently what you anticipate. That compassion can arrive from unusual locations. That a course can transform how you observe the existence. Her pupils frequently expressed humor at the account. Saline flesh? That was her substantial instruction? But Margaret comprehended something they didn't. She comprehended that conflicts terminate not simply with formal agreements, but with modest humanistic instances. A food preparer presenting additional servings. A sentinel indicating at a salutation. A plate of sustenance that communicated without terminology, you are still a humanistic organism. The German women who traversed through American prisoner enclosures transported those instances eternally. They transmitted them to their offspring. They murmured them to descendants. They documented them in personal accounts that historical researchers still examine today. And at the nucleus of many accounts positioned one humble dish. Rosy, saline, unusual, unforgettable. Corned beef was never about flavor. It was about what occurs when propaganda encounters actuality. When anxiety encounters compassion. When adversaries uncover that the opposing side is also humanistic. The women arrived as detainees. They departed as observers. And their declaration reverberated for lineages. In the termination, America's greatest armament was not its explosives, its aircraft, or its military. It was a heated plate of saline flesh presented without animosity to women who anticipated none. Across Germany, returning prisoners communicated comparable narratives. They characterized American enclosures with disbelief. Complete courses, pristine coverings, medical attention, equitable handling. Many Germans declined to possess confidence in them. The accounts resonated like propaganda, like falsehoods formulated to make Americans appear favorable. But they were accurate. Based on post-conflict documentation, the mortality proportion in American prisoner enclosures was reduced than 1%. Compare that to Soviet enclosures, where up to 30% of German detainees expired from starvation, ailment, and termination. American imprisonment was not pleasant, but it was endurable. Frequently it was more than endurable. The sustenance was a representation of something more substantial. American prosperity was authentic. It was not deception. It was not compensation. It was simply how Americans existed. They possessed more sustenance than they necessitated. They distributed it even with adversaries. They presented corned beef because corned beef was what they consumed. For women cultivated under Nazi philosophy, this was impossible to comprehend initially. They had been instructed that Americans were feeble, luxurious, ethically deteriorated. The propaganda illustrated a depiction of indolent capitalists who would disintegrate under compression. Rather, these women discovered a country so prosperous that even its detainees consumed superior than German common citizens. A country so arranged that it could nourish hundreds of thousands of seized adversaries without protest. A country that handled women warriors with fundamental respect instead of retribution. The opposition demolished something within them. Margaret Vogel, the woman who once documented about not possessing confidence in the Americans, subsequently transformed into one of the most vocal supporters for German-American companionship in her community. She provided lectures. She documented articles. She communicated at educational institutions. Consistently, she returned to the matching account. The corned beef account. Because for her, that saline flesh constituted a pivotal point. The instance when she understood that everything she had been informed was falsehood. The instance when the adversary transformed humanistic. Historical record recalls confrontations. It recalls commanders and formal agreements and capitulation rituals. But occasionally the most authentic historical record occurs in dining facilities, in modest instances between unfamiliar individuals, in the flavor of unfamiliar sustenance that gradually transforms recognizable. The German women who initially attempted American corned beef didn't recognize they were component of something more substantial. They solely recognized they were experiencing starvation, frightened and distant from homeland. What they uncovered transformed them eternally. Not the sodium. Not the rosy flesh. But the uncomplicated action of being nourished by an adversary who selected not to function like one. That is the instruction of this account. That humanity endures even in conflict. That courses can transport significance. And that occasionally the most unusual sustenance instructs the most profound authenticity.